Censors always thought they could stop audiences from seeing what they didn't approve of. But exploitation movies had other plans. These films weren't polite. They were loud, brash, and made to shock. And the harder the censors fought, the bigger these movies got. So, what happens when a film is too wild, too outrageous, and too profitable to stay buried? Let's count down 15 exploitation movies that censorship tried to crush but couldn't keep in the ground. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Sometimes a debut film doesn't just introduce a director, it rewrites the rulebook. That's exactly what happened when Wes Craven unleashed The Last House on the Left. On the surface, it was a simple story. Two teenage girls heading to a concert cross paths with escaped convicts, leading to an ordeal so brutal that their own parents take revenge. But it wasn't the plot that shook people. It was the raw, unflinching style. Craven filmed it like a documentary, giving every moment a disturbing realism that censors hated. The British Board of Film Censors outright refused to classify it in 1974, essentially banning it. Over in America, some drive-ins refused to book it, while others leaned into its infamy, using the tagline to avoid fainting, keep repeating, "It's only a movie." That phrase became legendary, partly because audiences really were fainting, vomiting, and leaving theaters mid-showing. For decades in the UK, it was one of the most infamous video nasties, with uncut tapes seized and screenings shut down. But every ban only made it more desirable. Bootlegs circulated, late-night screenings packed theaters, and by the time the film was finally released uncut in the early 2000s, it had already cemented its reputation. Craven himself later said he was shocked by the reaction. He thought people would understand it as an allegory about violence. Instead, it became one of the most feared and banned films of its era. Today, it's a cornerstone of exploitation horror, proof that sometimes the movie censors most want to bury is the one that refuses to die. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Few exploitation movies have caused as much outrage as I Spit on Your Grave. Directed by Mir Zarchi, it tells the story of a writer attacked by local men who decides to turn the tables in the most brutal ways imaginable. Critics called it everything from garbage to depraved. Roger Ebert, never one to hold back, gave it 0 stars and called watching it one of the most depressing experiences of his life. But the more critics raged, the more audiences got curious. The movie was banned in countries like Australia, Norway, and Ireland. In the UK, it bounced in and out of legality for decades, with censors cutting chunks out only for new versions to be seized again. Yet, despite all that, the film grossed over $5 million worldwide on a tiny independent budget. For a grindhouse revenge story, that was massive. The reason it survived wasn't because of glowing reviews, it had almost none. It survived because people couldn't stop talking about it. Protesters condemned it, newspapers attacked it, and governments tried to ban it. But in the process, they gave it free publicity no marketing campaign could have bought. Zarchi himself said the idea came from real life after he helped a victim of violence get to the police and saw how badly she was treated. That raw anger bled into the movie, giving it an intensity that audiences either despised or admired. Decades later, it remains one of the most infamous exploitation titles, an example of a film that censorship couldn't erase, no matter how hard it tried. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. When people think of banned exploitation films, they often imagine endless gore. But here's the twist. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre barely shows any blood. What it did show was worse. Director Tobe Hooper crafted a grim nightmare about five friends stumbling into the home of Leatherface and his cannibal family. Shot with a handheld documentary-style grit, it looked terrifyingly real. That realism was exactly what spooked the censors. In the United States, the MPAA refused to grant it an R rating, dooming it to limited release. In the UK, it was flat-out banned for decades, with the prohibition so strict that even the word chainsaw was banned from other film titles. Canada joined in, with several provinces refusing screenings. But here's the kicker. Audiences loved it. On a shoestring budget of around $140,000, it grossed over $30 million, making it one of the most profitable indie films ever. People lined up at drive-ins, not just for scares, but for the experience of enduring something that felt forbidden. Critics were divided. Some called it disgusting. Others called it genius. What no one could deny was its impact. It essentially created the blueprint for the slasher boom that followed. Films like Halloween and Friday the 13th owe it everything. For years, censorship boards fought to keep it locked away. But by the late 90s, it was finally restored to full release, where it was recognized as a horror classic. Proof that you don't need gallons of blood to horrify people. Sometimes just the suggestion is enough to keep censors awake at night. Faces of Death, 1978. Now we get to one of the most infamous VHS tapes ever made. Faces of Death wasn't a story-driven film at all. It was presented as a documentary, exploring the nature of death. What audiences actually got was a disturbing mashup of staged gore scenes, mixed with real footage of accidents and disasters. That mix of reality and fakery made it legendary and dangerous. Censors hated it. The UK banned it outright, classifying it as a video nasty. Australia, New Zealand, and Norway also outlawed it. Even in places where it wasn't technically illegal, video stores refused to carry it. Owning it became an act of rebellion. Kids whispered about it in schoolyards. Bootlegs passed hand to hand. If you had a copy, you were automatically the cool one in the neighborhood. Here's the wild part. All that controversy only fueled its success. Shot for around $450,000, it grossed over $35 million worldwide. That's an insane return for what was essentially a mixtape of gore effects, real or fake. Director John Allen Schwartz later admitted about 60% of it was staged, with the rest being authentic newsreel clips. But by then, the damage and the legend was already done. Faces of Death became the ultimate forbidden fruit of the VHS era. Parents panicked, lawmakers ranted, but the movie kept spreading underground. Even today, its name carries a kind of cursed weight. It's the perfect example of how censorship can backfire, turning something that should have been forgotten into a global cult sensation. The Devils, 1971. If there's one movie that proved even big studios couldn't escape censorship, it's The Devils. Directed by Ken Russell, it told the story of political hysteria and mass accusations in 17th century France. With Oliver Reed and Vanessa Redgrave leading the cast, Warner Brothers expected a prestige historical drama. What they got instead was one of the most incendiary films ever made. The movie was loaded with scenes of hysteria, corruption, and raw violence. Warner Brothers panicked, chopping entire sequences out before release. Even so, censorship boards worldwide slammed the brakes. The UK forced brutal cuts, while other countries like Italy banned it outright. In the United States, it limped out in a hacked version, stripped of some of its most shocking material. And yet, even censored, it survived. Critics and filmmakers began recognizing its artistry, calling it a masterpiece hiding beneath the controversy. Guillermo del Toro and other major directors have openly praised it, while fans have begged Warner Brothers for decades to release the uncut version. To this day, the studio refuses to officially do so. What makes The Devils stand out is its sheer refusal to fade. For more than 50 years, it has lived in this strange half-life, part masterpiece, part banned artifact, and in a way that only adds to its legend. Sometimes the most powerful films are the ones you can't see in full. The Devils is living proof that even censorship can't fully kill a movie that refuses to be silenced. Snuff, 1976. Few films in history pulled off a hoax as effective or as infuriating as Snuff. Originally shot in Argentina under the title Slaughter, it was a cheap horror flick loosely inspired by the Manson family murders. That alone might have kept it in grindhouse obscurity. But then distributor Alan Shackleton stepped in. He filmed a new fake ending showing a woman being killed for real on camera, spliced it in, and marketed the film as an actual snuff movie smuggled from South America. The reaction was immediate chaos. Feminist groups protested outside theaters. Police raided screenings. The FBI even investigated, fearing it might actually be evidence of a crime. Eventually, actors from the final scene had to go on television to prove they were alive. By then, the myth had taken on a life of its own. In the UK, it became one of the most notorious video nasties, prosecuted under obscenity laws and banned for decades. Yet in America, the controversy made it money. Shackleton reportedly spent only $11,000 to shoot the fake ending and promote the hoax. The movie went on to gross over $1 million, a staggering profit for something so poorly made. The truth didn't matter anymore. Audiences lined up just to see what all the fuss was about. And in doing so, Snuff achieved what no censorship board could stop. It turned infamy into pure profit. To this day, the word snuff in pop culture owes its life to this scam. Proof that sometimes the biggest censorship nightmare comes not from the film itself, but from the story spun around it. Elsa, she-wolf of the SS 1975, shot on leftover sets from the sitcom Hogan's Heroes. Elsa, she-wolf of the SS, looked cheap, sleazy, and disposable, but instead it became one of the most infamous exploitation films ever made. Diane Thorne starred as Elsa, a camp commandant obsessed with proving women could endure more pain than men. What followed was a barrage of cruelty and twisted experiments that made critics recoil. Produced on a budget of around $150,000, financed partly through Canadian tax shelters, it shocked even hardened grindhouse fans. Critics demanded bans. Countries from Australia to Germany to New Zealand outlawed it outright. Even the cast and crew tried to distance themselves from it, suing to get their names removed, but censorship only gave it oxygen. The movie grossed over $2 million worldwide, spawning multiple sequels despite every attempt to bury it. Fans passed around bootlegs, grindhouses packed seats, and it developed a reputation as the kind of movie you only watched if you wanted to test your limits. What made it impossible to kill was its audacity. It was offensive, outrageous, and proud of it. The censors hated it, critics despised it, but audiences kept showing up. Today, Elsa stands as a cornerstone of exploitation cinema, a movie so notorious that every attempt to erase it only carved its name deeper into history. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, 1973. From Sweden came one of the roughest exploitation films ever made. Thriller. A Cruel Picture followed a mute young woman kidnapped, hooked on drugs, and forced into degradation, until she trains herself to strike back with martial arts, weapons, and cold precision. Director Bo Arne Vibenius called it commercial as hell crap, but what he delivered was unforgettable. Advertised as the movie that has no limits of evil, it lived up to the slogan. The uncut version even spliced in real adult inserts, ensuring many countries immediately banned it. Australia, Germany, and the United States all blocked its release. Sweden, it was barely screened at all, yet audiences who saw it never forgot it. Quentin Tarantino famously cited it as an influence, making Daryl Hannah watch it before playing Elle Driver in Kill Bill. What made it indestructible was its sheer shock factor. Even when banned, it circulated underground, whispered about by horror fans who called it one of the most brutal revenge films ever made. Bootleg VHS copies kept it alive, and eventually it resurfaced on DVD, finally gaining recognition as a cult classic. The irony is that Vibenius made it purely for cash after his first film bombed. He wanted quick money, not controversy. Instead, he ended up with a movie that outlived bans, outlasted critics, and became a grim legend in the revenge genre. Sometimes, the films meant to be disposable end up being immortal. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. If there's one exploitation movie that censorship boards wanted to destroy completely, it was Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Shot in the Amazon on a tiny budget, it was marketed as the most shocking movie ever made. The story followed a film crew who disappears in the jungle, only for their recovered footage to reveal atrocities committed by both the filmmakers and the indigenous people. The movie was so convincing that Italian authorities believed it was a real snuff film. Deodato was arrested and had to prove in court that his actors were alive by bringing them out of hiding. That's how far the controversy went. On top of that, the film's graphic violence and real animal cruelty pushed it past the limits of what censors would tolerate. Countries like the UK, Australia, and Italy banned it for decades. And yet, despite bans and seizures, the film became a cult phenomenon. Bootleg VHS copies passed through horror circles, and word of mouth kept its legend alive. By the time it was finally released in censored or uncut editions years later, it had already achieved mythic status. Today, Cannibal Holocaust is considered both one of the most disturbing movies ever made and a pioneering example of found footage filmmaking. Censors may have tried to bury it, but audiences kept digging it back up. Proof that the harder you try to kill a movie, the stronger its reputation becomes. Faces of Death 2, 1981. When a movie is banned in half the world, what's the natural response? Make a sequel. That's exactly what John Allen Schwartz did with Faces of Death 2. Released just 3 years after the first film, it doubled down on the same formula. Staged gore scenes mixed with real footage. Critics laughed it off as exploitative trash, but audiences lined up anyway. Censors tried to crush it immediately. Many of the same countries that banned the first film extended their restrictions to the sequel, including the UK, where possession of an uncut tape could land you in court. But the demand was unstoppable. Video stores stocked it under the counter. Kids swapped it at schools. It became the forbidden franchise. The sequel also leaned harder into shock value, with more elaborate stage sequences and increasingly disturbing real-life footage. The mix blurred the line between fiction and reality so much that for some viewers, it felt like watching a cursed tape. Despite the bans, the sequel rode the notoriety of the first movie straight into cult fame. It proved once again that censorship only made these films more desirable. And while critics dismissed it, audiences passed it around like contraband. If the first Faces of Death was the forbidden fruit of the VHS age, Faces of Death 2 showed just how hungry people were for more. Caligula, 1979. What happens when a serious historical epic collides with unchecked exploitation? You get Caligula. Written by Gore Vidal and starring respected actors like Malcolm McDowell, Helen Mirren, and Peter O'Toole, it started as a prestige project about Rome's most infamous emperor. But behind the scenes, Penthouse publisher Bob Guccione took control, secretly filming new scenes at night and cutting them into the movie without the actors' consent. The result? Chaos. McDowell disowned it. Mirren called it a disaster. And even Vidal walked away, saying it wasn't the film he wrote. Censors worldwide scrambled to figure out what to do with it. Some countries banned it outright, while others hacked it into heavily censored editions. In the United States and UK, different cuts floated around for years, none of them considered definitive. But despite the bans, it made money. With a reported budget of $17 million, massive for the time, it grossed over $20 million in the US alone. That kind of success, even amid scandal, proved that the controversy was good for business. Audiences showed up not to watch Roman history, but to witness the forbidden film everyone was talking about. Today, it's remembered less as a history lesson and more as a spectacle of excess gone wrong. But its survival shows that once a movie becomes infamous, no censorship board can erase it completely. Caligula remains the ultimate example of an exploitation film hiding in plain sight, dressed up as art, but sold as scandal. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If there's one director who built a career on poking censors in the eye, it's John Waters, and Pink Flamingos is his masterpiece of shock. The film follows Divine, a Baltimore icon battling a rival couple for the title of filthiest person alive. What follows is a barrage of scenes designed to disgust, disturb, and make audiences question why they were still watching. Censors loathed it. Some theaters refused to screen it. Police shut down showings and entire cities banned it. But none of that stopped the underground buzz. Audiences lined up at midnight screenings, daring themselves to get through it. The more outrageous the movie got, the more people wanted to see it just to say they had survived it. Waters knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't trying to please critics or mainstream audiences. He was making a cult event, and it worked. The controversy elevated Pink Flamingos into legend, cementing Waters as the Pope of Trash. Here's the twist. Decades later, the same film once banned as filth ended up preserved in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. Criterion even gave it a polished release. What was once forbidden became historic. That transformation alone proves the power of shock cinema. A movie designed to repel ended up celebrated, and all the censorship in the world couldn't stop it. Cannibal Ferox, 1981. If Cannibal Holocaust was the most notorious jungle exploitation film, Cannibal Ferox was its meaner sibling. Directed by Umberto Lenzi, it carried the tagline, "Banned in 31 countries," and it leaned hard into that promise. The plot followed travelers who run into hostile tribes, but the real draw was the outrageous gore and set pieces. Censors came down on it fast. In the UK, it was one of the most aggressively prosecuted video nasties. In Australia and Germany, it was completely banned. Even when heavily cut versions slipped through, they were pulled off shelves quickly. Yet audiences couldn't resist. Bootlegs circulated, and the film's forbidden reputation only grew stronger. Critics called it trash, but horror fans treated it like a rite of passage. To say you had seen Cannibal Ferox was to prove you could handle the most extreme the genre had to offer. Lenzi himself leaned into the controversy, marketing the film with ads that dared people to watch and survive. Financially, it rode the coattails of Cannibal Holocaust, becoming a hit in the grindhouse circuit and internationally on VHS. Its survival was a perfect example of censorship backfiring. By trying to bury it, censors turned it into a dare. And for exploitation cinema, nothing sells better than the promise of danger. Dawn of the Dead, 1978. George Romero had already changed the landscape of horror with Night of the Living Dead. But when he returned a decade later with Dawn of the Dead, he didn't just raise the stakes, he blew the doors off. The setup was genius in its simplicity. Survivors of a zombie apocalypse barricade themselves inside a shopping mall, fighting both the undead and their own greed. It was part survival horror, part blood-soaked carnival, and part savage satire of consumer culture. The gore was groundbreaking for the time. Special effects wizard Tom Savini created head explosions, gut-munching, and scenes so grisly that ratings boards didn't know how to handle it. In the US, Romero refused to cut it for an R rating, releasing it unrated instead. That move limited mainstream distribution, but only increased its underground status. In Europe, censors hacked it to pieces or banned it altogether. Germany went as far as keeping the uncut version illegal for decades. And yet, no amount of censorship could stop the momentum. With Italian horror legend Dario Argento backing its international distribution, Dawn of the Dead became a worldwide hit. Made for less than $1 million, it grossed over $55 million, turning a low-budget splatterfest into one of the most profitable indie films of its time. Critics were split down the middle. Some dismissed it as excessive, while others, including Roger Ebert, praised it as one of the best horror films ever made. What no one could deny was its cultural impact. By combining unrelenting gore with biting social commentary, Romero created a film that censorship boards tried to smother, but audiences kept alive. Dawn of the Dead remains a masterpiece, a zombie movie that proved unstoppable. Blacula, 1972. Not every exploitation film survived censorship because of gore or controversy. Some survived because they were simply too good to ignore. Blacula began as just another attempt to cash in on the blaxploitation craze of the early 70s. But when William Marshall stepped into the role of the cursed African prince turned vampire, everything changed. Marshall refused to play the character as a joke. He gave Blacula depth, tragedy, and dignity, transforming what could have been a throwaway gimmick into one of the first serious black horror icons. The film blended gothic atmosphere with funk-era energy, featuring a killer soundtrack that even got radio play, a first for horror films at the time. Censors didn't outright ban it, but they didn't know what to make of it either. Critics mocked the title and dismissed it as cheap, but audiences embraced it, pushing it to over $7 million at the box office, far outpacing its small budget. It even won the first ever Saturn Award for Best Horror Film in 1973. By sheer popularity, it survived every attempt to brush it off as trash. It proved that exploitation films could do more than shock. They could deliver genuine cultural impact. Decades later, Blacula is remembered not as a joke, but as a milestone in both horror and representation. Proof that sometimes the censors lose, not because a movie is banned, but because the audience refuses to let it disappear. Exploitation cinema was never built to play it safe. These films were messy, outrageous, and unapologetic, but every time censors tried to bury them, audiences dug them back up. That's the paradox. Censorship didn't kill these movies, it made them immortal. So, which of these do you think deserves its reputation the most? And which banned movie would you dare to watch if given the chance? Drop your thoughts below. Hit subscribe for more deep dives. And remember, some movies are just too wild to die.